general principle would not have required him to call attention to any mere references to the first epistle of John, first epistle of Peter. Their genuineness had always been acknowledged. But as a matter of fact, he does call attention to the references to those epistles which are found in some early writers. He may have thought, says Dr. Lightfoot, that this would conduce to a just estimate of the meaning of silence in the case of disputed epistles to Peter, 2 and 3 John. Eusebius was a man of large learning. He had accessed some of the best libraries of Christian literature that existed in his time. Many books which are now lost were in his hands, and from some of them he gave interesting, important extracts. It was his declared purpose to collect and to record whatever information he found in early Christian writings, both concerning the 7 disputed books and the books which had secured their place among the sacred books of the Church. He was a firm-minded man with instincts and habits of a scholar, but throughout his history there is no hint that any uncertainty ever existed in the Church with regard to the authority of the 4 Gospels. There is nothing to suggest that they had first appeared after the death of the men whose names they bear. It is inconceivable that Christian churches, independent of each other, inheriting different traditions and situated in different countries, would have come to accept these 4 books as the genuine writings of Matthew and John, Mark and Luke. If they had appeared for the first time and without explanation when Matthew and John, Mark and Luke had all passed away, and if any explanation of the late appearance had been given, it is also inconceivable that no trace of it would have survived. In the Christian writings which have come down to us, there is no hint of any such explanation. If any hint of it had existed in the writings which are now lost, but which Eusebius possessed, he would certainly have told us about it. Take the Gospel of John. If a book of such immense theological importance as the 4th Gospel had appeared for the first time 30 or 40 or 50 years after John's death, can we imagine that its claims would have been unchallenged? Would no church writer have expressed a wish for some account of its history? Would no question have been asked as to the reason why, if it had really been written by the apostles, it had not been given the church 30 or 40 years before? Down in the middle of the 2nd century and later, there were Christian bishops living in different parts of the world who, in the early years, had known John or the friends of John. Would they not have wanted to learn how it was that the gospel of which they had never heard had appeared with John's name? And would not the unknown writer who had the courage to attribute his fiction gospel to the apostles have also had the courage to give some fictitious answer to these inquiries? Would not the miraculous ingenuity which enabled him to write a story of Christ, which during so many centuries has commanded the wonder and awe of mankind, have been equal to the invention of a tale concerning the manner in which the book had been preserved, and the grounds for delaying its publication, which would have had irresistible fascination and charm, a tale far too beautiful and too pathetic to have passed out of the memory of the Church? If any questions about the book had been asked, if any answers had been given, Eusebius would have told us about them, for he promises to mention what had been said by earlier writers concerning the undisputed books, as well as about the disputed books. He makes a specific promise to mention what they have said about the 4 Gospels. But any of such inquiries as those I have suggested about the Gospel of John, of any explanation as those inquiries must have drawn out, he says nothing. That this gospel would have been received by the church without controversy if it had appeared 20 or 30 years after the death of John is incredible when we consider the contents of the gospel itself and the controversies by which the church was harassed throughout the 2nd century. Gnosticism destroyed the power of the gospel by changing it into philosophy. By those who were contending earnestly for the faith once for all delivered to the saints, it was regarded with intense hostility. But among the technical words of this formidable heresy are the words which hold so conspicuous a place: John's gospel, only begotten, life, truth, grace, fullness, word, light. Did the Gnostics get these words from John, or did the unknown writer of the 4 Gospel get them from the Gnostics? The words are just characteristic of the gospel attributed to John, as of the system taught by Valentius the Gnostic, though in John they have a different power. Who used them first, the writer of the 4th Gospel or Valentius? If the fourth gospel had appeared for the first time at any date after 120 AD, what chance would it have had of being received by those who were fighting Gnosticism as the deadly foe of the Christian Church? To take a parallel case suggested by Professor Solomon of Dublin, suppose that when the controversy of the Reformation was at the hottest, it had been announced that the manuscripts of the Epistle of Paul, previously unknown, had just been discovered in some ancient library. Suppose that when the manuscript was published, it was found to be full of such words as transubstantiation, purgatory, indulgence. Would not every Protestant have rejected as a forgery? Suppose that the epistle had been published and accepted as genuine 10, 20, 30 years before Luther nailed his thesis to the door of the Church of Wittenberg. Would not the outbreak of the Reformation have provoked a fierce controversy concerning its genuineness? If the fourth gospel had appeared as late as 120 AD, when Gnosticism was becoming very powerful, the churches which held fast to the traditional faith would never have acknowledged its authority. If at the date it had been only recently received as the work of an apostle, received within the previous 20 years, and received in inadequate evidence, its authority would certainly have been challenged, and some traces of the controversy would certainly have survived. I just want to say, this issue about which came first, the Gnostic Gospels or John and the Gnostic Gospels, that there's been a rubbish dump that was found in Egypt with thousands of manuscripts on it. I've documented this in other videos. And the Gnostic Gospels in the rubbish dump were generally small handwriting, and the main Gospels, I think there was 3 specifically that were found, were in large handwriting. And they realized that large handwriting was seen as public information. They were read out in public and seen as important, whereas the small handwriting was seen as pocket paper, newspaper kind of writing. So that rubbish dump clearly showed that the Gospels were seen as authoritative for public consumption, reading in public space, showing that John's Gospel came first rather than the Gnostics. We go on. If the fourth Gospel had appeared as late as 120 AD, when Gnosticism was becoming very powerful, the churches which held fast the traditional faith would never have acknowledged its authority. If at the date it had been only recently received as the work of an apostle, received within the previous 20 years, and received on inadequate evidences, its authority would certainly have been challenged, and some trace of the controversy would certainly have survived. But I repeat that in the Christian writings of the 2nd century, which are in our own hands, there is no trace of any controversy on the genuineness of John's Gospel. And the silence of Eusebius assures us that there was no trace of any controversy on this subject in the Christian writings not now lost, which he found in the library of his friend Pamphilius, or in the library of Bishop Alexandria at Jerusalem. The inference seems to me irresistible. There was never any controversy concerning the genuineness of the Gospel of John, because there was never any uncertainty about it. And there was never any uncertainty about it because it was published in John's lifetime, and all John's friends knew that it was his. Yeah, I think there's I think it's a clear argument. There's issues about Papias and his mentioning of John, which John is it? But I think the argument still stands. There's no controversy about John in those first 200 years, which shows you that it was an established as an authoritative book amongst the Christians in 1st and 2nd century AD in Rome, in the Roman Empire. Well, we're going to go on and do another one now. And hope you find it a blessing. And thank you for listening. Take care.